There are many people worried that America is going broke.
We continue to issue between $1 and $2 trillion a year.
And since the 1980s, that issued debt has accumulated to around $34 trillion, around 120% of America's GDP, reaching levels of federal debt not seen since the Second World War. These fears over federal debt are a misguided understanding of how fiat currencies actually work. First and most familiar of these myths is the idea that you should think of the government's budget as being like a household's budget. Famous quote from Margaret Thatcher to illustrate this popular view.
The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more.
So the myth is that governments must first tax or borrow your money into their bank account, and only then can they spend it. And it's a convenient myth for the politicians who wish to shrink the size of the state through austerity measures. They claim to have to cut the education or welfare budget in order to pay off the country's mythical credit card. For countries that have financial sovereignty over their own fiat currency, like America, the UK and Japan, the household budgeting myth gets the order of things completely backwards. And that's because these countries are the currency issuer rather than just a currency user. You or I, or indeed individual states or cities within America, cannot simply create new dollars. If we want to use dollars or pounds, we have to first get hold of them. But if the American government needs to spend more dollars, it can just create them. And it does this all the time. It doesn't need to first borrow from the markets or collect tax dollars in order to spend. And here's Ben Bernanke, former chair of the Fed, America's central bank, essentially acknowledging this.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
So rather than tax and borrow, then spend, what actually happens is spend and then maybe tax and borrow. This sounds radical compared to how we typically think of money and government debts. Does that mean there are no limits? Can we just print our way to prosperity? Absolutely not. MMT is not a free lunch. But even for America, that issues the dollar, what about all of their $34 trillion debt? Won't they have to pay it back to somebody someday? Now, when taking on a debt, it's always worth remembering that there are two aspects of the debt to worry about. How to pay back the total amount borrowed, the principal of the debt, and how to pay the regular interest payments on the debt, what is sometimes called servicing the debt. Imagining an extremely simple model of the economy with just two buckets, one for the government sector and one for everything else in the economy, including foreign debt. Now, if the government spends $100, then taxes back $90, that will leave a surplus of $10 in the non-government bucket and an equivalent deficit of -10 in the government bucket. Economists typically want the total sum of all buckets to add up to zero. Now, if this is what happens in one given year, then this -$10 would be the government's deficit for that year. As years go by, the cumulative sum of the deficits in each year is the total debt owed by the government. Again, for America, their total accumulated debt is the $34 trillion figure. So that is their current principal on which they owe interest. And I said the debt is owed by the government. But owed to who? The government sector being in debt enables the non-government sector to have a surplus, to be in the black. And conversely, if the government sector were to tax back more money from the broader economy so that they were in the black, that would put the non-government sector into the red. Interesting study by Frederick Thayer, in which he showed a noteworthy correlation between years when America paid back substantial amounts of its debt and economic depressions that followed just after. As Kelton put it, fiscal surpluses suck money out of the economy. So, as history suggests that paying back too much of the principal debt could actually damage the economy, There is never going to be a moment in time when our children or great-great-grandchildren are going to have to pay back all of the debt. Individual treasury bonds, bills and notes will get paid at maturity, but new debt will also be issued that largely maintains the overall debt level. But if the overall debt level isn't going to be substantially paid back, won't it just slowly grow and grow? And then how much debt is too much debt? Well, there are two parts to this. The first is the sustainability of paying the regular interest payments, and the second is the risk of causing high inflation. When we casually use the phrase the government, we often mean the executive branch of the government, which includes the treasury that manages the government's money and issues different forms of government debt. The central bank of a country, the Federal Reserve or Fed in the case of America, is nowadays mostly an independent body that stands separate from the executive, while still being very much part of the government sector of the economy. And it's only the central bank that can actually create or print new money. It can create new green dollars. The Treasury can't. But the Treasury can issue debt. So if the government of the day spends $1,000, then taxes back $900 so that it is in $100 of deficit, there is a long-standing norm that the Treasury will then issue $100 of debt to be purchased by actors within the non-government sector. So this brings the cash balance of the executive, the government, back to zero by taking on $100 debt. Now, these dollar-denominated debt instruments, like Treasury bonds, are yellow dollars, which are almost as liquid as green dollars. But a key difference is that yellow dollars are interest-bearing dollars, whereas regular green dollars do not pay any interest. Now, crucially, the central bank is legally prohibited from lending directly to the Treasury. It can't just buy these yellow dollars from the Treasury with the green dollars that it can print, but it can buy yellow dollars from the market, and it does so often. Traditionally, central banks buy yellow dollars from the open market as one of their ways to manage interest rates. And once they've bought those yellow dollars, the Treasury's debt is now just owed to its own central bank, owed to just another part of the government sector. Indeed, in order to manage the yield curve, long-term interest rates, the Central Bank of Japan has bought so much of Japan's national debt from the market that nearly half of Japan's debt is now owed to the Central Bank of Japan. So, essentially, that debt has already been paid off by the Bank of Japan printing money to pay for it. And after the financial crash of 2008, the use of quantitative easing in America and Britain and the euro area was, in effect, a way for central banks to end up buying large amounts of government-issued debt. So while the independence of central banks creates the legal fiction that the executive can no longer just print as much money as it wants, in reality, the executive can create as much debt as it wants, creating interest-bearing yellow dollars. And then the central bank can print the money to convert some of these yellow dollars into green dollars in the general economy as it buys up this government debt. And given that that is exactly what's been happening over this last decade, but surely there are consequences for all this printing of debt and money. So we need to talk about inflation. But before that, I just want to note one detail about debt sustainability. The general consensus among economists is that as long as the interest rate owed on the debt is less than the growth rate of the economy, then the interest payments on the debt will be sustainable over the long term. And that is why the Bank of Japan was buying so much of its nation's long-term debt, to keep the long-term interest rates near zero, and therefore below Japan's growth rate. This will, in theory, allow Japan to slowly grow its way out of its debt over time. And because central banks can do this and have various ways to influence interest rates, that is why modern monetary theorists think that servicing the national debt can always be kept sustainable. Okay, but what about inflation? An interesting quote from JFK speaking in the 1960s to one of his advisors, the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Tobin. Tobin recalls JFK asking, "Is there any limit to the deficit? I know, of course, about the political limits, but is there any economic limit? When Tobin confessed that the only limit is really inflation, the president replied, "That's right, isn't it? The deficit can be any size. The debt can be any size, provided they don't cause inflation. Everything else is just talk." But how can you create more money without it inevitably leading to more inflation? There are many people still stuck in a mindset inherited from the era of the gold standard, when, since the value of dollars was tied to gold, if you printed more money, then you had to acquire more gold in order to honor your promised link to the gold. But by going off the gold standard, America could then print money without growing their pile of gold. And so now it seemed clear that this must dilute the value of the dollar relative to the fixed pile of gold. This is certainly how most Bitcoiners think about fiat currencies like the dollar. But actually, a more correct way to see how the value of the dollar is maintained is that it is backed by all of the goods and services that the dollars can buy. So now, if you print more dollars, you don't need to grow the pile of gold. You have to grow the real size of the dollar economy. As Kelton put it, coming up with the money is the easy part. The real challenge lies in managing your available resources, labor, equipment, technology, natural resources, and so on, so that inflation does not accelerate. You don't want to have too much money chasing too few goods. So the extra demand from the extra money needs to be matched with an extra supply of goods and services. And that prevents the prices from going up. That prevents inflation. From this, Kelton argues that the key question for governments shouldn't be, how shall we pay for it? But rather, how shall we resource it? Now, of course, inflation is much more complex than this, but I hope I've given you a sense of why countries like America and Japan have been able to have long periods with high deficits and so growing debts, but still have low inflation.